start our Facebook. So welcome to this Wednesday's webinar. As we get started here, we're letting people join. Thank everybody for joining us today. Getting our live stream going for Facebook. All right, that number counter is still going up, Ari. So for those that have joined us, and while we wait for the others, if you'll notice the scrolling on our screen, some of our sponsors of the ATBA, and those sponsoring our event coming up April 25th, 2022 in Las Vegas at NAB, our Monday night LPTV industry event. Also, our sponsorship page and membership page, pay attention to that at broadcastingalliance.org. We would love for you to join, or for our companies and in some of our larger networks, station owners to actually be sponsors and help us with the many things that we have going on, including our meeting with the FCC yesterday. And so I'm going to go ahead and get us started and want to welcome everybody to this Wednesday webinar on the 17th of November, 2021. I'm Lee Miller, Executive Director of the Advanced Television Broadcasting Alliance, the LPTV and OTT Industry Association. We are a 501c4 nonprofit organization with a board of directors, and we do appreciate all of you guys out there supporting the organization. So with that done, I'm going to introduce to you Ari Meltzer, and we have become to know him quite well in the last few weeks. And yesterday we had a visit with the FCC. And before we jump into that, first, Ari, tell us about you and Wiley and what you do, how you got involved in broadcasting or being a broadcast attorney.
Sure. Thanks for having me on here, Lee. So I am a partner at Wiley Ryan LLP. We have the largest telecom media and technology practice, I believe, by number of attorneys in the country, or if not, pretty close to in terms of number of attorneys, breadth of work. So I have a background in broadcast journalism. I was a television news producer originally for local TV, for Tribune Broadcasting's DC bureau, and for one of the networks. And then at some point decided that broadcasting wasn't fun enough, so I wanted to become a lawyer.
Oh, wow. Well, at least we do know that you've been somebody that has been in the trenches out there, like many of the folks that are on our webinar today, actually working in the biz. So we do appreciate that greatly. We appreciate Wiley Law Firm and taking us to the FCC yesterday. And we had a great meeting there because lots and lots of questions in the LPTV industry of what is reality, what's rumor, what's new, what's old. And I think you're going to give us a rundown of what we learned at that meeting yesterday and what reality is, right?
Exactly. And glad to work with you guys and take you in. Let me go ahead and put some slides up and I'll walk everybody through some of what we learned yesterday. Hang on one second here.
Okay, yeah, and working to avoid the death penalty. And I know that's what many of us here in LPTV world are hoping to avoid at all costs, is the loss of our license. And hopefully with the information that you have here today, we're going to all be able to hang on to our licenses and get those stations built that we have construction permits for. So on with our update.
Great. So yeah, so we yesterday we went to the FCC and by telephone and had a meeting with Barbara Kreisman, the chief of the video division at the FCC, her legal advisor, Sean Maher, the legal advisor for the Media Bureau, Evan Morris, and then also Mark Colombo was on the line for that call as well. So talked about a couple things that we will walk through with everybody today. The first is navigating the FCC's new license condition that I know is probably not new information for anybody here, but that the FCC has started putting conditions on LPTV licenses relating to operations. So we'll talk about what that means, what the condition actually says, and what the FCC says it means. And then we also will talk about, as we said, avoiding the FCC death penalty is the term that they used, and talking about what happens when a construction permit expires and when a station has been silent for more than a year. So let's jump right into the license conditions. So last month, a condition started showing up on licenses that the FCC was issuing for LPTV stations. And you can see the text of the condition on the screen here. Grant of this license application is conditioned on continuous operations of the licensed facility for the 12-month period following grant. The failure to so operate will result in the rescission of this grant, dismissal of the license application, and the forfeiture of the associated construction permit pursuant to 47 CFR 733598E, unless the licensee rebuts that presumption that the authorized facilities were temporarily constructed. So what's important about that? Really three terms in that condition that we want to focus on. The first being continuous operations, the second being the duration, the 12-month period, and the third being the presumption that the authorized facilities were temporarily constructed. Now, I want to point out when we first reached out to the FCC to schedule a meeting, and then yesterday, they were a little bit defensive, I guess is probably the best way to put it, about the condition and the suggestion that they were doing something new by adding this condition to LPTV licenses. So right. The position of the FCC's video division is that this isn't a new requirement. This is a recitation of what the FCC has always expected of LPTV stations, and that it's identical to a condition that the audio division had been putting on licenses for the last 4 to 5 years. With that said, the FCC had not been putting this on video licenses, and there was no announcement to go along with adding this to video licenses. So I think it took some licensees by surprise, and I think it took the industry as a whole by surprise to see this show up, and people were reasonably skeptical and had some questions about what the FCC was trying to achieve by adding this condition, and about what the FCC meant by this condition and what does it mean as an LPTV station operator.
Right.
So, the first part that I said I wanted to focus on was this issue of continuous operations. And what the FCC tried to clarify yesterday was that it doesn't require a station to operate on a 24/7 basis from the minute that they get their license. But it does mean that the operations should be permanent, was the term they used, and continuous in accordance with minimum operating requirements for the service. Now, I think a question a lot of people have is what is the minimum operating requirements for an LPTV service? And of course, it's very loose what requirements you have as an LPTV operator. So I think the focus really is going to be probably more on the permanence than on the minimum operating requirements. And that's something I think the FCC is going to focus on, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Because the 12-month period, I think, has a little bit to do with that as well. So I think another question a lot of folks had when this condition started appearing on construction permits is, does this mean from the second I file my license application, I've got to be on the air consecutively from the same location with no changes for 12 months? And the FCC was pretty clear that the answer to that is no. There's not an actual requirement that you have to operate continuously from those same facilities for 12 months. But that gets into the last part, what we talked about, which was the presumption that you are operating from non-permanent facilities. So if a station is at the same facility for less than 12 months or is not operating for 12 months consecutively, then the burden's going to be on the station to demonstrate that those operations were permanent and not temporary. And the FCC, I think, was very careful not to draw a bright line as to what that actually means to be on permanent operations and not temporary. They said it would be very fact specific. We did discuss two, what I'll call extreme situations. The FCC was clear that what they view as being not okay is the station applies for its license, then immediately goes silent, and then immediately files a modification to move to a different facility.
Right.
Now, certainly that's something that if you look through LMS, you can find a lot of examples of stations having done that over the last many, many years. And, the FCC didn't really, Barbara in particular, her comment was essentially that they were a little bit asleep at the wheel and weren't really paying attention to what stations were doing. But now that they are focused on it, that is something that they believe would not be consistent with their rules and operations. What she did say would be okay is if you file your license, you operate on a continuous basis for 3 months. And then if there's a tower issue, if there's a technical problem, if there's some reason why you have a bona fide need to move to a different facility, that would be a minor modification. That would generally be considered continuous operations that, while fewer than 12 months, would overcome that presumption. So it's really a totality of the circumstances that the FCC is looking at without a lot of really clear guidance for situations that fall within those extremes.
Right. Many people have expressed concern over that. Okay, I've got a transmitter. I can get up on the air right now and be on the air, but this is not my real transmitter. I've got another one coming that might end up here, in May. So that means I can't change out that transmitter. Well, that we've clarified that now.
Yeah, exactly. So, changing out a transmitter is going to be fine if your lease ends in 3 months and you don't negotiate a new lease, but you go to a facility up the road and you're operating, sort of continuously through that transition period, that's generally going to be okay. I think where there's going to be a lot of focus is going to be on stations going silent, particularly without an unexpected technical reason, so to speak. So, it's one thing, sure, if your transmitter goes out, something happens to the antenna and you've got to go silent and you can provide that explanation. I think the FCC is going to consider all of those to overcome the burden. But if a station files the license and then shortly thereafter goes silent, that's going to draw a lot of scrutiny. And I think the burden is going to be a lot higher on a station to overcome the presumption in that instance. And one thing that they really focused on is including an explanation for any moves within 12 months. And I think that's fairly important because if we go back here to the language, the failure will result in the rescission of the grant, dismissal of the application, and forfeiture of the construction permit. If you apply for a minor modification and you're still on the air and you provide an explanation for what you want to do, the worst thing that's going to happen is the FCC is going to ask you for more information and say no. But if you're already off the air and silent at the time that you're then requesting a modification, then you're opening yourself up for the FCC to take one of these actions and to say, no, we don't consider that continuous operations. We're rescinding the grant of the license and dismissing the license altogether.
Yeah, and I know you're going to get into this later, but the other thing is just putting down, my transmitter broke. is not sufficient in regards to, they want details. They want lots of information. Matter of fact, I heard this: you cannot give them too much information. And sometimes we are concerned about that. Well, I've got 100 pages of documents here. I don't want to overwhelm them. Now, I think I heard, go ahead, overwhelm us with your information.
That's right. That's exactly right. Give them as many details as you can. Give them documentation to support whatever narrative you're providing. Tell it as strong of a story with as much as you can, and that's going to help make the case. Now, I think a lot of what, reading between the lines, a lot of what is influencing the FCC here is some concern over station hops and stations. What they would say is trying to get around the minor modification limit of, the 30-mile move requirement. And you can see my bunnies there doing their little hop at the bottom of the screen. So
Right.
I think it's fair to say that stations that are making multiple moves are going to draw greater scrutiny going forward, that the FCC is going to be paying attention to how frequently stations are moving. And that's going to be something that they're going to take a look at. They have not set a bright line that you can't move or that they won't accept certain moves that ultimately result in going more than 30 miles. But I do think that's something that they're going to be taking a close look at. Factors that they said they were going to think about in determining whether the hops are legitimate are looking at the nature of the construction. So one thing that we had discussed with them was, on the radio side, the FCC is going to look at whether you installed the antenna on a permanent facility, whether if it was government property or some other property that you don't own, whether you had permission to be on that property. And they said things like that would all be very relevant to their consideration.
Do you have permanent electricity, for example? Not
exactly.
Just a generator sitting over there in a corner you fire up.
Yep, exactly. The duration of operation, again, as we said, 12 months is what they put on this license condition in terms of their presumption, but there's nothing hard and fast about 12 months. And I think that goes in both directions. You could potentially move in fewer than 12 months if you have a good reason for doing so. If it's longer than 12 months, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to give it scrutiny, although this condition seems to at least imply that if you've been at the same site for 12 months, you're going to get some more flexibility from the FCC. And then this is the big one, the purpose and the pattern of the relocation. So they're going to be looking at, have you moved before? How many times have you moved before? Why have you moved before? And did you give them a justification for why you need to move to a new facility when you applied for that application?
Well, I think they were very, very plain in regards to that. So if I have a station in Lufkin, Texas, and I want to move it, I can't move it to Houston. That station was to serve the community of Lufkin, Texas. But if I want to move from the north side of town to the south side of town, just because I got a better transmission or transmitter tower, 12 miles away, okay, that's a different story. I'm still serving the community the license originally was granted in.
Exactly. And that's again, it's easy to talk about extreme examples. You get into the, well, what if it's 35 miles and there's not overlap with where I originally was 5 years ago, but it's a better service now. And I don't think they're going to be hard-lined about that. I mean, one thing that they did say was they understand that things change, and they understand that this, circumstances have changed since the 2009 window. Circumstances have changed generally, but that doesn't mean that they're, on the flip side, going to allow stations to just say, well, in 2009, it made sense to serve this area. Now it makes no sense to serve this area, so we're going to move, 150 miles away. That's something that they're not going to tolerate. So I think they're going to stick to the spirit of what they will say is the spirit, and certainly it is the view. There were, if you go back and read the orders, there were certainly different justifications for why it was a rural window in 2009, but their view is very much that part of the intent of that window was to serve rural areas, and they want stations to generally be serving those areas that where the permits were originally issued.
Right.
All right, so actually before I jump forward, let's say you've got your license and you have this condition on the license. What do you do about it? I think generally the condition is, in a way, what the condition is, and I think hopefully some of this information will help clarify what that means. And I think some LPTV owners may have to recalibrate what their plans are for their permits and for their stations going forward based on that. The only other real legal option is you can file a petition for reconsideration against your own license, challenging the license condition. But of course, you got to remember, this is a regulated industry and you're regulated entities here. And if you start filing challenges to your license because you don't like the condition, that's going to put the antennas up at the FCC on what are these guys doing and why do they think they need to challenge the condition.
Right.
Which, is not to say that in individual circumstances that doesn't make sense, but I think you've really got to think carefully about, is it really worth taking the FCC on in that circumstance? So of course, one of the reasons why this is on a lot of people's minds is because stations have construction permits that are going to be expiring. If you had one of the permits that was expiring over the summer, you got your 6-month extension. January 10th is when you're going to have to get on the air at this point. And a lot of stations have been silent for a while at this point too, as they've been either have been silent because they haven't built out or have been silent because they're in the process of building out their facilities.
Well, and something that most people have not need to consider in the LPTV world is many have not built out because we were waiting for the repack and the dust to settle to make sure we don't build something that we're going to have to turn around and rebuild tomorrow.
Exactly. So now you find yourself up against a deadline, and very good reasons, particularly, I think you had a confluence of 3 events. You have the repack went longer than the FCC originally said it was going to go. You had a lot of stations either that backloaded and had to move further back in the transition than they had initially planned. And you had a lot of stations that wound up going past the original phase 10 deadline, and some that are still in some full power stations are still in the process of building out now. So depending on where you are, you don't even necessarily have that certainty, even at this time with your deadlines approaching.
Exactly.
Then, of course, we had COVID on top of that. And then, of course, now we've got a lot of supply chain issues on top of that. So it really is a perfect storm. And if you don't get built out and you don't get permission from the FCC, you face what they call the death penalty. If that CP expires, you're not getting the CP back. If you've been off the air for more than a year, under Section 312G, you lose your license automatically. So, but the FCC at the same time was very clear with us that they understand what's going on in the world. They're not looking to be penal or to take a harsh position with permittees that have good reasons for why they're not able to complete construction. And they will be very open to requests for tolling waivers or for waivers of Section 312G. So, and that could be for really any reason, but in particular, if you had COVID or supply chain disruptions, the FCC is willing not only, I think, to listen, but made it pretty clear that as long as you provide the right justification and what they consider to be a valid justification, they will grant either tolling waivers or waivers of the 1 year off-air deadline. So just quick terminology clarification. So waiver of tolling. So the FCC has a tolling rule for construction permits. And that means exactly what it says. It's the FCC can toll the permit meaning from a certain date in time, whenever the tolling event occurred, until the tolling event ends, they'll extend the construction permit by that amount of time. So, you know, you have a litigation over your construction permit that stops you from building. You have a major act of God that happens, something like that, that prevents you from building out. The FCC's rules have built-in tolling. But the FCC also has a provision where they will waive tolling and essentially grant an extension, not because you meet one of the strict criteria, but because you've had rare and exceptional circumstances that prevented construction. The FCC also will waive the 1-year off-air deadline, where doing so would promote equity and fairness. That's in the statute that the FCC has the authority to do that. And in fact, in both of these circumstances, the FCC has been doing so over the last year or two for stations that have needed it. So you've got a situation where your equipment's not coming in on time, your tower crew can't get out. There's some reason, whether it's due to COVID, whether it's due to supply chain, maybe something else, that you can't meet your January deadline or your upcoming deadline, either to complete construction or to go back on the air. So when do you request an extension? What the FCC has said is go to them about a month before either the CP is going to expire or the station will have been off the air. That's kind of the sweet spot between where things have crystallized and you have a sense of whether you're actually going to make your deadline or not. But it's not so close that you won't have the ability for the FCC to grant your request before the deadline. They'll consider requests up to and including the day of your deadline. So if circumstances change, you know, you expected the equipment to be delivered 2 weeks beforehand, it didn't make it, your crew got delayed at another site, your crew got sick, whatever it may be, they will consider requests at any time. But that they don't want you filing too far in advance where circumstances may change and you may not actually need it. So 1 month is generally the sweet spot to file, but there's no hard and fast rule that says you have to apply 30 days ahead of time or you can't apply more than 45 days or anything like that. And then what's required for a showing? I mean, one thing that the FCC stressed was because they view this as the death penalty, you want to make sure you get this right. So if you've got legal counsel, and this was their words, not mine, I'm not plugging for business here, but they said, you know, if you've got legal counsel, this is the time to use them. You want to make sure that somebody understands what the standard is to get a waiver and that they're tailoring your request to make sure that you get that. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you make a good showing that you would have completed construction, but for whatever circumstances have come up. What they're really looking for here is this wasn't just because you sat on your hands, you waited until 2 weeks before the deadline to think about ordering an antenna, and then you realized you couldn't get an antenna in 2 weeks. So you want to show that you've been diligent. The flip side is you don't have to show that the day you got your permit, you immediately placed your orders. But you've got to have been reasonable in your approach is what they're looking for, that you were doing something that a reasonable operator who was trying to get on the air before the deadline would have done. And then as Lee discussed a little bit earlier, include lots of specifics, include as much as you can, timelines, dates, communications, correspondence, what caused the delay, and what's the plan for completing construction. If you've got relevant documentation, whether it's correspondence with the manufacturers, correspondence with the tower crews, put it in there. The FCC is going to want to see that.
Right.
The flip side of that is if you just say we couldn't make it on the air because of COVID or we couldn't make it on because we had supply chain issues, they're going to come back to you and say that's not good enough. We want you to show us, to make a clear showing for what were the issues. You know, what was the COVID related delay? What was the supply chain issue? And what's your plan going forward? When do you expect to have this resolved, and when do you expect to get back on the air? And that's generally all I got, Lee.
All right, well, this is the time that we open it up for questions. So for all those out there in the audience, you can use that Q&A button on your screen or the chat. If you would like to chat with us, that'd be fine too. But we can't leave Ari all alone without a single question. I'm just kind of amazed that you haven't had any pop up yet, but you've done a good job of covering our meeting yesterday. And we do appreciate everything that you guys have done for the ATBA and going forward, and to keep us all on the straight and narrow. So anybody out there got a question? Well, I was about to say that you had you got off lightly, but as you can see there, why are they suddenly deciding moves are bad?
So if you take it at face value, again, what they've said was essentially that they were caught sleeping at the wheel a little bit, that they just weren't paying a lot of attention. I think Barbara admitted that from her perspective, at least as the head of the video division, it's just not something she was paying attention to. So I'm not sure it's necessarily a sudden decision that moves are bad as opposed to a sudden focus on moves. And we saw that, what was it, about 3-4 years ago, the DTV America order came out, which was kind of the first statement in a while about moves and about the need for permanent construction. And from their perspective, that was sort of the putting everybody on notice. And this is the next step in that process.
Right. We've actually seen this for a number of years now. So it's nothing that they just started doing. But we have seen this for a while. So Keith asked, the FCC has allowed waivers of the 30-mile move limit. Do they ever allow those anymore? And I guess you somewhat answered that, but go ahead and address that again.
Yeah, I mean, they've said they'll consider the circumstances. So there's no hard rule that says you can't. So I guess there's two parts to that question. The first is if you say, I need to move, the only available tower is 31.3 miles, not 30 miles. Will you waive the 30-mile limit? The answer is yes. They will still consider waivers of that limit and requests to treat those as minor changes as opposed to major changes. And then if you are in a hop situation where the second move is taking you more than 30 miles from where you started, the FCC is going to look at the totality of the circumstances there.
All right. Susan Hanson is asking, can you talk a little bit about late filing?
Late filing. So I'm assuming Susan's asking what happens if you miss your deadline and fail to file anything before then. I think the answer is you're going to lose a lot more sleep over that. That's not to say that the FCC will not grant a request. And if you look through LMS, you can find a lot of examples where people have missed deadlines for one reason or another, and they've requested. So you have to, at that point, you're not just requesting tolling, but you're requesting reinstatement of your permit or reinstatement of your license. And that is something that the FCC will consider, and they have in the last year or two been fairly flexible about. But I think you're going to sleep a lot better if you get that request in before the deadline, and the FCC is turning those around pretty quickly. So if you get something in a week or two before the deadline, you're probably going to get at least a confirmation, an informal confirmation from the FCC that yes, they're working on it, they're going to grant it, if not a formal grant before the deadline.
Right. So Keith asked what to do if you file a petition for reconsideration and the FCC sits on it for over a year. Are we seeing that?
Yes, it depends on the situation. The FCC is certainly known for sitting on things that it doesn't want to deal with. And you don't have a ton of recourse there. I mean, at a certain point, you can go, I guess there's two ways to go about it. One is informally to keep asking the question and trying to get the FCC to take some sort of action. And then at some point you can go to courts and request mandamus, where the court's telling the FCC, you've got to act on this request. But there's no streamlined, unfortunately, the FCC does not have a shot clock to act on petitions for reconsideration. So you're really at the mercy of the agency there.
All right, well, Randy says, I have just a comment. Ari's comments are much appreciated.
Thank you, Randy.
So, all right, so Ruben says the groups that hold hundreds of LPTV CPs and can't pay for the construction costs, do they have the death penalty? I think the FCC in our meeting was very strong that there's some people that probably just need to turn in their license, their CPs. I heard that, didn't you?
Yeah, I did, and I think their view would be you've got a deadline and you've got to make it. Or again, there's flexibility and there's middle ground there, and if it's not a purely numerical game where they say if you've got 20 CPs, then we think it was within your control, but if you had 10, it wasn't within your control. But at the same time, you've got to have a good reason for why you didn't make it, and just having a lot of permits that you haven't gotten around to building isn't going to cut it.
All right, somebody anonymous says the FCC was very generous in granting 312G waivers during the repack period, but tolling requests are being resisted vigorously, even with large amounts of documentation. Doesn't that seem rather inconsistent in policy?
I guess I haven't seen that as much. I think they have been, what I've seen, at least in my practice, is in the last maybe 2 or 3 months, they've been pushing for a little bit more documentation, and they've been more likely to come back after somebody files a request and asking for more information. And you may get a very formal letter from Barbara Kreisman with, we want you to answer these 4 or these 5 questions about what we're looking for. But they're just looking for more information, and they want you to bolster your showing. When I've come across that, in most cases, they've ultimately granted the request if you've provided enough information, but they are looking to see that you had, again, a real bona fide reason why you need tolling or why you need an extension here.
Well, again, significant information, volumes of information, not just, COVID, the supply chain has kept us, they want details. When do you order? Where's it at? Who have you spoken to? They want those details to help them to prove your case, and you really do need to prove your case in regards to why you're asking for them to do that.
And they're going to write that in. I mean, if you look at you're going to get a letter order back when they don't just say we're granting the waiver. You get a formal written letter from the FCC explaining what the circumstances are and why they thought it was justified. So I would look at it as giving them enough information and trying to help the FCC. So when staff is trying to write these letters granting your request, they've got enough information to do that.
So there's another anonymous one out there that says there's an LPTV that's been off for more than 18 months, no filing with the FCC in the database, and they don't understand how they're retaining the license. Are you seeing any of that out there?
I'm sure it's out there. I don't know off the top of my head. It may just be a situation where staff just hasn't gotten around to rescinding it. But I wouldn't know without taking a look at it.
And Keith asked, is there any special consideration for Alaska LPTV CPs to be extended further?
I haven't heard anything specific to Alaska LPTVs recently.
And when will DTS operations be allowed for LPTV? And I assume he's talking about maybe single frequency networks.
Exactly. Yep. And I don't know what the timing is on that one. I'd have to get back to you on that.
I mean, there are some special authorities being granted for that for testing, obviously.
Right.
And I do know some of those. Are tolling requests and reasons public documents?
Looks like a few people are putting that in there. Yes,
right.
they are public documents. So you file a tolling request in LMS, even if it's a waiver of tolling where you don't clearly fit within those tolling, the 3 requirements, you would still file it as a tolling request in LMS. That is publicly available. Anybody can go in, anybody can see that. If for some reason you had documentation or a reason that you believed was truly confidential, there was competitive business information in there, something like that, you can always send it to the FCC and request confidentiality. But again, remember that you're trying to help them write this order. So the more you can give them to do that, and it's going to be a public order, so the more you can give them to do that, the better.
So what equipment details does the FCC require to be filed for an LPTV station, such as antenna model, transmitters, line, etc.?
I'm not sure if the question is when you're applying for the permit, or if you're when you're trying to seek tolling. And I guess there's two questions here, because some stations that we're dealing with are eligible for reimbursement because they were displaced, where you're going to have to give every detail of what's in your, in the facility that you're seeking replacement for, or I'm sorry, that you're seeking reimbursement for. But for a standard application, you still have to provide, information about the antenna. You don't need the transmitter details, except for, I believe you have to put the loss information or have the calculation in there still. But as you're going through a tolling request, to the extent that any of that is relevant to the need for tolling, you should certainly be sure to put that in the request.
This next question from Richard. Does the FCC expect to open a window for new TVCP licenses to reach new audiences? I reside on Indian reservation. There's absolutely no OTA. And I guess at this point in time, because mum's the word at the FCC, but maybe your crystal ball. Well, I will say we requested that, didn't we?
We did, and actually, even before we requested it, I think they made some comment about that they were looking into or thinking about. They sort of described it as twofold, that right now they're trying to clean up what's on the books today, but they recognize things have changed and there may be a need to open up a new window, whether it's for modifications or whether it's for new applications. As of now, there's a freeze on that. They would have to open a specific window for that. What's interesting is full power stations, there's no freeze right now on petitions for rulemaking for a new allotment. And we've seen some of those go through in the last 6 months, 12 months. But for LPTV, there's still no window to file for new stations. So it's probably coming. Is it coming in the next 6 months? Probably not.
And unfortunately, some of those new allotments for full power have been at the detriment of LPTV.
Right.
As well. So we have that issue we're facing with some of our membership as well.
Yep.
So what's the FCC thoughts about LPTV and 3.0, and how will the FCC nominations affect the future of LPTV? What's your crystal ball saying?
That's a really good question. I think the FCC has been supportive, I think, of ATSC 3.0. I mean, we've seen them come out with orders to facilitate the deployment. We've seen the FCC just recently put public notice out at the NAB's request to modify the rules to make it easier for stations to apply for 3.0 licenses for multicast service. So I think the FCC is dipping its toe in the water on 3.0. I think they're being supportive of the industry. At the same time, you don't see an FCC push, aside possibly from Commissioner Carr, to really get behind 3.0 and say this is something that we're actually going to champion. I think it's more, we're going to go along with this, we're going to support this, and we're going to see where it goes. As far as the nominations, I don't think they're going to make a huge difference in the FCC's policy toward 3.0. Obviously Commissioner Rosenworcel's been on the commission for a long time. She's acting chairperson now. She's supported a lot of these initiatives over the years. And Gigi Sohn has not, as far as I can see, taken a position. She's certainly going to be somebody who's going to be interested in, I think, some of the data capabilities of 3.0 and the ways also to use 3.0 to provide service to the underserved populations. That'll be something that will certainly resonate with her. But this isn't going to be a front and center issue, I don't think, for either of them.
All right, we've got a lot of questions, so I mean, opened up the floodgates
I
there.
say you shook them loose and they came.
Yeah, so Matthew asking if slides will be available. I guess that's up to you, Ari, whether we make those available to folks or not, or this is a taped event available on our website. So I think that would probably be the easiest thing, is just go watch the replay, right?
That's right. If somebody wants it, they can reach out and we can probably share it. But yeah, obviously the replay is available as well.
All right, let's see, what do we got that we haven't answered yet? Won't the new LPTV window be for fill-in translators?
Unclear. Well, so there's, if we're talking about a window for major mods and for new stations, that's what we were referring to before. So there is kind of, in the long-term future, we think that's something that the FCC is actually thinking about. Fill-ins is a kind of separate issue, and it's not one that we really discussed with them.
All right, Susan asked, Channel 6 CPs now have new restrictions concerning the FM oral broadcast. Are they dead in the water? Many CPs changed hands during 713, but we just had the Channel 6 out on the West Coast doing radio on ATSC 3.0.
Yeah, and I will admit to my interests there of representing a few of the Channel 6 licensees. So I filed a few of these applications. Yeah, so the FCC has granted those on a temporary STA basis, which is good. I think a lot of the operators of those stations thought they were completely dead, and the FCC has allowed it to continue for right now. And I haven't heard of any issues from a technical standpoint, whether it's with reception, with interference. From everything that I've heard, that seems to be operating fairly fluidly. So if that continues, I think they probably have a future.
Now, here's a good question in regards to reason for extensions, and that's weather conditions. We're now getting into winter, transmission systems on top of mountains that are, got plenty of snow right now, and you can't get to the site.
Yeah, and I think the FCC is going to be very open to that as a reason. Again, to the extent that you can show why you didn't anticipate that. So is there a reason? You can certainly stack reasons on top of each other. So I ordered my equipment 6 months ago. It got delayed by 3 months. Now we're into the winter weather and I can't get to the site. I can't access the site. It wouldn't be safe to go to the site to complete construction. You really want to tell your story. But yes, weather has always, even before COVID and before supply chain disruptions, always been something that the FCC would consider for tolling. So I think that would be the case here, particularly where it stacks on top of some of these other reasons.
All right, and we'll take maybe a couple more because we have run you way out of time. But
that's right.
Since there's no specific mention of permanent facilities and about time between modification requests, does this change in policy violate the APA? As in, does the video division actually have the authority without an NPRM with public comment? Can this group point that out to them?
So it's actually, there's not a clear answer to that question. So there's no rule that I'm aware of that says that you have to operate from permanent facilities. But the FCC has extrapolated that from its rules, and they've been saying that since well before this license condition came out. There was a long discussion about that in the DTV America order and consent decree. And there's cites in there to other cases where the FCC has raised that issue. So it's been the FCC's view for a long time that you have to operate from permanent facilities, and they've used the language that when you file a license, you're standing ready to operate. That hasn't been obviously something that's been put on a permit before, so there is some question as to how enforceable it is, but it wasn't completely out of the blue either.
All right, well, we have run way past our time today, Ari. We do appreciate you joining. I know there's still dozens and dozens of questions out there, and people that want to interact with us, but maybe send me an email, info@broadcastingalliance.org, and we'll try to answer some of those questions offline, or maybe turn them into a news feature or news article in our newsletter or on the website broadcastingalliance.org. So again, that email address is info@broadcastingalliance.org. And all right, we appreciate you joining us today and what you're doing for us at the FCC. And we're going to tell our audience bye for this week. And we will be taking a break for Thanksgiving, and we'll probably have something coming up in December. We haven't announced that yet, but many thanks for everybody joining us. And Ari, you've got many thanks coming in our questions and chats as well. So again, we appreciate you being with us, and
Thanks for having me.
We'll see everybody next time. Y'all have a great day.
Take care now.